Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Showing Up to Your Life podcast and YouTube channel. My name is Art Burns. And so yesterday I talked about, the end of the year, right? We're always very naturally inclined to look back upon the last segment of whatever we've gone through. And in the case of a new year, that means looking back over the course of the year. But we do this with all kinds of stuff. Naturally we do it, even unconsciously we do this, right? Where we kind of take stock in what we've gone through, right? Again, whether that's, taking stock on a date that we just had with someone, or taking stock in a project at work, or taking stock in the year that's just passed, right? And so this is a very natural, activity of the human mind. It's something that we want to do. It's a natural orientation instinct that we have as human beings, right? When you wake up in the morning, if you don't know where you are, every single ounce of energy and attention is going to be spent figuring that out before you do anything else, right? And that's true for us no matter what age we are, no matter where we are in our lives, no matter what's going on. We need to be oriented. We need to know where we are in the physical space of where we're, of our existence, or else we feel very, afraid, and that's a stress response, right? Until we get that orientation. And so it's a very natural thing to orient ourselves, based on what we've gone through, right? Again, it's a very natural human instinct. However, it can become very, very sort of difficult, or it can invite some difficulty into our lives if we do this without consciousness and without intention, right? Not only that, but there's also this negativity bias that I talk about a lot, right? That exists in all of us. It's something that we're not going to get rid of, but we can neutralize it, right? But this negativity bias is going to make you, as you're looking back over whatever you've been through, right? Whether that's the last year, a couple of months, a day, an hour, whatever it is, you are more likely to see the negative aspects of what's going on. So if you're looking back over the course of a year, you're more likely to see things like failings on your part, or missed opportunities, or regretful situations that you were in. You're not likely to see the beautiful, wonderful moments that happened along the way as well. And of course, this is a way that we're instinctively trying to protect ourselves, right? It's just part of our evolutionary defense mechanism, survival mechanism, to make us pay attention to the stuff that is dangerous, right? And so of course that's not necessary, and it's not true necessarily when we're looking back at things. It doesn't mean that more bad things happened. It means that you're only perceiving and paying attention to the bad things rather than the good things, right? And so what I suggested yesterday in the video is to apply self-compassion, right? As well as maybe even a little gratitude, and applying these things can help us to move past the areas of difficulty that we see, in the areas of shortcomings and failings and whatnot, and see through that, and see past that, and see some of the things in our lives that actually are really, really wonderful, because we all have wonderful things that are happening in our lives. And in fact, we can even use some of the negative aspects of our lives, the challenging moments of our lives of the past year or whatever, we can use those things to grow and to understand ourselves a little bit better. And so for that, they are actually good experiences, right? They are not negative experiences. They're actually become positive, or you can turn them into a positive experience by way of gratitude and self-compassion, right? And so there's another sort of way to look at this whole concept, right? Right now we're looking mostly, because it's New Year's Eve today, by the way, Happy New Year to everyone. We're looking at New Year's Eve today, so we're looking back over the last year, right? This is a natural thing that everybody does, culturally too, right? You're gonna see on all the different TV shows and the different radio stations stuff, there's going to be like every radio station will play every #1 hit from every week of this year. That's what goes on, right? Because again, it's part of our internal instinct, so it's become a cultural instinct as well, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. Again, if it's done with intention, and it's done with consciousness, and it's done with a measure of self-compassion and compassion for others and gratitude, well, then there's nothing wrong with it at all, right? It's actually a very fun thing and a very beneficial thing to do for ourselves, right? But now let's talk about when we're looking at our entire lives, right? Because we tend to do this also, right? And again, we tend to do it in the same way I talked about yesterday. We tend to do this without intention and without consciousness and without presence or acceptance or compassion or curiosity. And what this means is that just like the year, we are likely to look back at our lives and see times in which we were at some kind of fault, right? That we somehow did something wrong to create a circumstance to that resulted in suffering of some sort, right? Or we miss an opportunity to do something, or we failed in some way. That's just generally speaking what we're likely to see. Okay, same principle. It's the same negativity bias that applies when we're looking back over the last year as we're watching like a Twilight Zone marathon over New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, right? And so but when we're looking at our whole life, right, it changes. It's obviously got a different perspective because we're looking at the entire time that we've been on the earth, right? And so when we can apply the same level of self-compassion, right, and allow ourselves the compassion to say, like, okay, well, maybe it's not all my fault, everything that happened, right? Maybe it's like instead of kind of beating myself up over the things that I've done over the course of my life and all these shortcomings and all these failings that I'm identifying as I'm looking back over the course of the lifetime, if I can apply self-compassion and not want to be so quick to blame myself for these things and instead encourage myself and to support myself through these difficult moments that I'm remembering, well, then maybe I can open myself up to the real source of some of these difficulties that I felt, right? And a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily on you. Right? It's and again, this really is, the important thing if you're going to look back on your life and be able to even apply self-compassion to see through the negativity bias and the prism that makes you feel that, oh, I have failed, I have done wrong, I have hurt people, and so on and so forth, which gets us to blame ourselves. The key to all of this is to first be intentional and conscious about this process. Okay, again, it's not going to happen if you're driving your car and you're thinking about something from your childhood that that made you suffer in some way, right? Because again, in that unconscious space, you're really going to overwhelm yourself with the negativity bias, and that's going to make you feel even worse about what it is. But there is a way that you can look at it as what it really is, right? Not through the negativity bias, but through a balanced and conscious kind of view of what it is that you're talking about. And if we do that, now we can, like I say, we can open ourselves up to the concept and the potential and the possibilities that maybe there are other forces at play, right? Maybe, and again, self-compassion alone is going to make you recognize the fact that you did what you thought you should do at every given moment of your life, right? Like, you did not set out to ruin things, right? Most of us don't have that in us, right? We tried, we did the best we could with what we had to work with, right? And self-compassion is something, if you practice it and you get to the point where self-compassion is a default mode for you, well, this is something that's going to arise naturally. Okay, and so this is a really, really powerful practice that I'd be more than happy to tell you about. Okay, but the thing I want to talk about here is really specific. Okay, and this is going to be very, very helpful to all the parents out there. I hope some of the parents are still watching here, 8-9 minutes in here, but this is going to be especially helpful for parents, right? Because there is this sort of, and even if you're not a parent, it's going to be helpful for you. But with parents especially, because parents are, and this also includes anyone who's planning to become a parent someday, right? Parents are part of what can often be an unconscious cycle or an unconscious pattern, right? That is generational. Right, it's something that gets passed on from one generation to another, to another, to another, to another, and the whole time. And I touched on this yesterday too, but with parenting, it's specifically pertinent, right? Because what happens is, it's a generational thing, right? So what the way it kind of works, right, is like, like wherever you want to start, right? You can go as far back as you want to. You can start with who you are, right, and who your parents were and who your grandparents were, for instance, right? The idea is that whatever your grandparents lived through, right, they kind of developed their own sort of inner voice, right? That inner voice that talks to themselves, as they're going through something, right? And now this, and this is of course influenced by whoever their parents were, right? You're influenced by what you have around you, not just your parents, but also your siblings, your teachers, your friends, their parents, all of these different people in your life. That's where you're gonna kind of build this sort of worldview, if you will, right? And part of your worldview is how you talk to yourself, right? And how you kind of, that inner voice that we all have, right? And so is that inner voice something that is very hard and gosh darn it, you got to get up, you got to keep going, you got to, push, or is that inner voice something that is supportive and kind and caring for yourself, right? And the reason I bring up the generational patterns is because that inner voice is specifically and really, really powerfully susceptible to the influence of the parents and the grandparents and the great grandparents. So let me explain what I mean by that. Okay, so let's say I'll use myself as an example, right? And I think I talked about this yesterday even, but my grandfather, right, grew up. My mother was born in like 1943, I believe it was 1940. Yeah, she's 1 year younger than Jerry Garcia, so 1944, I believe. And so that means that her father grew up in, just in the precursor of the Great Depression, right? Like right in the, a couple of years before the Great Depression, right? And so when I can consider that, right, I can look at and see that, okay, so the life that my grandfather was leading, in the, and my grandmother as well, a couple of years before the Great Depression. So that means that by the time they were, 4 years old, the Depression was in full swing, right? And things were hurting, just like we're hurting now, so what was very likely to be true, right, is that my grandfather and my grandmother's parents, separately obviously because they weren't grandmother and grandfather as of yet, but separately, right, they were both living through an experience where their parents were likely feeling a great deal of stress, right? And a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of suffering and difficulty, right? And of course, during the Great Depression, like as far as we understand, like that's as bad as it ever got in America, like people were literally, killing themselves because they lost everything. Now, I don't think my grandparents or great-grandparents were rich by any I have no evidence of that. I don't have any evidence to the contrary, but I'm not going to assume that they were rich. But what I am going to assume is like everyone else in the world at that point, but certainly in America, they were suffering. And when people are suffering, they're feeling stress, right? Because they're afraid, like, how are we going to feed our children? How are we going to keep the roof over our head? How are we going to warm the house up, right? They were in that stress response. And when people are in that stress, because they're worried because of the suffering that is surrounding them, right? They are generally going to be, unfortunately, less compassionate, right? Like compassion is one of the first things that goes. However, what I'm teaching people these days is that is the absolute one thing that you gotta hold on to is compassion, especially compassion for yourself. The harder things are, the more compassion you need to get through them. Right, but unfortunately, that instinct is that compassion is somehow a gratuitous thing or like kind of gravy kind of thing. Like it's not essential, right? What's essential is putting food on the table, right? And if putting food on the table means that I have to go and hurt somebody to get food on the table, then I'm going to do that, right? And that's kind of that sense of where compassion gets pushed off to the side and it becomes something that's not that vital for people in terms of the perception, right? And so with that logic, right, it is very, very likely that my grandfather and my grandmother's parents were not very compassionate. it was probably not a very compassionate, and I say this because I have evidence, and I'm going to get to that in a second. I mean, it's not necessarily that everybody wasn't compassionate, but my particular grandfather, I'm pretty sure wasn't, and I'm going to tell you why in a moment. But again, chances are that he was talked to by his parents in a way that was hard, right? That was tough. That was, like I'll whip you to get you to do your chores if that's what it takes, because we're all suffering here, and we need to do better, right? We need to work harder. We need to push ourselves to get out of this, right? That's probably, in all likelihood, that's the environment in which he grew up with. So what happens is, right, the outer talk of my great-grandfather, right, became the inner voice of my grandfather. Right? So when his father is telling him all the time, like, don't mess up, work hard, we got to feed the women, all this kind of stuff, right? There's this really hard stuff that goes on, right? Which you hear it in people now, even before COVID-19, right? This is a general sort of almost like an American spirit, if you will, right? I was just talking to a client this morning who was really grappling with the concept of non-striving. He was like, no, but in America, we gotta go, we gotta push, right? And so that voice that my grandfather, my great-grandfather, who was experiencing an enormous amount of stress, an enormous amount of fear, an enormous amount of anxiety, and probably some anger that gets mixed in with that, right? Because fear becomes anger, right? So he starts with fear, and that probably grew into all kinds of different emotions, including anger. So there was probably a hardness to his voice and to his words, right? And so that hardness became my grandfather's, that outer voice of hardness became my grandfather's inner voice. Right? And so what happens then is you fast forward, right? And throughout my grandfather's life, he is talking to himself the way that his father talked to him, right? And his mother talked to him. Same thing happened with my grandmother, right? Who also grew up in a very difficult situation, right? In the Great Depression, right? And so then when my grandfather became the father of my mother, right? The only voice that he knows is that inner voice that came from his father, right, during the Great Depression. And even though when my grandfather, had my mother, I mean, we were just like in the midst of World War II. So shortly after that, things got much better, but still he had this inner voice, right? Like that was his inner voice, and that inner voice that was hard and pushing and punishing and unrelenting and unforgiving, right? That inner voice became his outer voice with my mother, right? And therefore, that outer voice of his became my mother's inner voice for herself, right? And of course, that then became my mother's outer voice when I was a child, right? And then that is, that became my inner voice for a long time. And that's why for a long time, I never had any belief in myself. I never had any, trust in myself. I never had any compassion for myself. I was always beating myself up for not being better. Right? And so I look back and I say, like, why was I beating myself up over this all those years? Well, it kind of, when we divorce ourselves from that continuous, flow of the great-grandfather to the grandfather to the father to the son, right? If we kind of cut out that whole pattern, then we're left to think, well, something must be wrong with me. Right? Like all these years of my whole life, I've been feeling inadequate. I've been feeling, down. I've been feeling, not enough. I've been feeling like a failure, right? And so where does that come from? It must be something that's wrong with me that makes me feel this way, right? Makes me talk to myself this way. And of course, then if I'm looking back and assuming that it's just something that's on me, well, then guess what? I'm going to just repeat the pattern. Right? Then that inner voice that I have that's so hard and so mean and unforgiving is going to be the way that I treat my children, right? Because it's the only way that I know. Because that's what I had experienced, right? But when I can take into account all of these generational issues that happened along the way, now I can stop and I can say, aha, it's not me that created this. It's my great-grandfather who created this. Right? Now, this doesn't take away my own personal responsibility for myself, and that's why I do the work that I do, and that's why I coach people in the work that I do so that they can do it for themselves, right? Because at some point, you do have the power to reverse these and to change that that inner voice to one of compassion and kindness for yourself. And seeing the positive and seeing the bright outlook that exists, right? Instead of, again, if all I'm doing is listening to that inner voice that was given to me by my mother, which was given to her by her father, which was given to him by his father, which was given to him by his father, on and on and on and on and on, right? Then if I'm just going to unconsciously, live with that voice and listen to that voice, well, then again, in all likelihood, with just a few minor changes, the same pattern is going to happen. The same pattern is going to repeat itself. And then my children are going to grow up with the same inner voice that I have, right? And then they are going to grow up to instill that inner voice in their children, and on and on and on and on. That's why when people talk about this work that I talk about here, to make these changes for yourself, right? To learn to look at your life with self-compassion and forgive yourself, knowing that it's not on you, right? That most of what you're experiencing is programmed into you through sources and influences that you had no control over at all. Right? You literally have no control over it. We don't choose who our parents are. We don't choose what they went through. We don't choose, like, even when we're young, we don't choose who our friends are. We're friends with whoever's there, right? And so it's all very automatic and very unconscious, right? But what that does is that builds our very identity, right? That inner voice that we have, right? That's like who we are in a very big way, right? And so again, if we can learn to practice self-compassion and make that inner voice something that is kind and forgiving and loving towards ourselves and supportive towards ourselves, well, then what we can do is we can dismantle some of those negative aspects of our generational patterns and the generational trauma that we've experienced, and we can break the cycle, right? And therefore your children have a chance to become something that is different from what your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, kind of lived through, right? And it all starts with you. It's kind of ironic because it didn't start with you, right? But going forward, it starts with you, right? Like going backwards, it has, you had no control whatever. You're just the product of this thing. This pattern, this, generation after generation after generation. You're just a product of that you had no control over whatsoever. Right, and so you are not the beginning of the self-talk that you have. Right, it's not your creation. Right, but you can start today to create a new story and to create a new self-talk and to create a new way of meeting each moment of your life with presence, with acceptance, with compassion, and with curiosity. And that is what you can hand down to your children. And as I started to say, they talk about doing this work as something that when you make this change in yourself, you're going to impact the next 7 generations down the line. Right? That's how powerful this is. Because again, your outer talk is going to become your inner talk, right, is going to become how you talk to your children. And the way that you talk to your children becomes their inner talk. And then as they get older and they have children, then that inner talk is going to be how they talk to their children. And that is how the process is going to continue. And so you have the power now to either make that a positive and supportive and compassionate way to talk to yourself and to your children and their children and their children and their children, right? Or a negative one, right? And the choice is yours. And you can make that choice and you can make the change right now. as you're watching this video, you can decide to choose compassion. You can decide to choose support for yourself. You can decide to choose kindness. And think about it. Think about the impact that you could have, because, if you're like me, then you have suffered greatly with this self-talk, right? This self-talk is powerful, and it's damaging, and it hurts, right? And so think about what you have now. You have this opportunity now to relieve your children of that pain, to avoid that pain for them. And wouldn't that be lovely? And so, listen, it's a new year, right? A great time to start something new. So call me up and let's see if we can talk together and see if we can, just like so many of my clients have done. In fact, 2 clients this morning told me today that just, this living with self-compassion, they had no idea. They always knew that it was important. They always knew that it was something that I should be doing. But now that they've done it and they're doing it, they're like, I knew it was important, but I had no idea it was this important. So if you'd like to learn more, you know what I'm going to say, right? I'm going to say, contact me. Okay, go to my website, artburnscoaching.com. You can click on the button that says free phone consultation. Okay, what that is a coaching session. So you and I will get on that coaching session. We will dive as deeply as you want to dive, and we will get you some practices and some ideas right away. Okay, and for most people, right, if you're willing to commit to doing, say, 10 to 15 minutes of practice a day, and it doesn't even seem like that much, I'm going to get you to do more than that, and you're not even going to notice it. But if you can commit to doing that work, right, the science tells us that 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks, and you're literally, changing the plasticity of your brain, right? 8 weeks. That's all we're talking about. Think about that. So by March 1st, you could be in a completely different place with a lot less pain, a lot less suffering, and a lot less of this, kind of propelling this negative pattern. It's that easy. It really is. It's that simple. And as long as you're willing to put in some practice, and I'm going to help you to figure out how you can do 20 minutes a day without even realizing that you did a minute. Okay, that's how good I am. And I'm willing to do that for you if you're willing to take the step and get in touch with me. So let's make a deal. Let's do that, okay? Let's celebrate the new year together, and let's do that together, because it could save you, and it could really change things for you, and it could change things for your children, their great-children, their great-grandchildren. They're all down the line. All right, so hit me up. I'd love to hear from you. And if I don't hear from you, I wish you a Happy New Year, and I'll be back again. I think I'll do a video tomorrow. I'm not sure, but I got some exciting things for this new year. I'm going to really be talking about not just mindfulness, but also heartfulness. And I can't wait to share some ideas about that and to get people to practice compassion. Because again, it's clearer and clearer every single day how much compassion really is the answer. And I'd love to tell you, I'd love to prove it to you, so give me a chance. All right, everybody, Happy New Year. I'll be back soon, and I'll talk to you then. I really appreciate you. Take care.